Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. Good to be back with Adult Forum, and a big thank you to Michael Fabian for leading us in this 4-week series. So let's begin with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you. Almighty gracious God, we thank you for all the blessings of this life. We thank you for allowing us to gather safely at the beginning of this new day. We thank you for the opportunity to worship you. And we ask that you would pour out your Spirit upon us, give us your wisdom and your strength and your guidance, that all we do would glorify you. Be with us now and bless us. All these things we ask in Christ's name. Amen. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Good morning. How are you? It's good to be back. And it's great to see so many wonderful faces looking at me. Okay, today we are going to be talking about, is Jesus God? How do we know about Jesus? Did Jesus even exist, or did somebody make him up? What proof do we have? Are the Gospels accurate? So let's begin with, how many of you are 100% sure that Jesus is God? Good. How about like 80% sure? Yeah. 30% sure. We're going to just kind of launch in. It's kind of a complicated topic. And we're going to just launch right into it here. If at some point you have a question about what I'm saying, if you feel, sometimes when I get into these presentations and I'm putting them together, I kind of get into the weeds and things get a little cloudy. So if at any point you have questions, if you feel like, wait a minute, that didn't sound right, or what did he mean by that? Please jump in with a question. Let's see, I hope everything's working. I'm like double fisting it up here. So let's start by talking about ancestors. Because sometimes people say, did Jesus exist? Maybe he didn't exist. I don't know what this is all about. What did he do? Let's start thinking about your own ancestors. How do we know our ancestors lived? Anybody want to answer it? Photographs. What about further back? We'll talk about that. The fact, I'll give you a little spoiler here. The fact that we are here proves that our ancestors exist. There's no question that, we had to have ancestors or we wouldn't be here. So let's think about 4 generations ago, which would be parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents. For me, that would take me back to about 1860. How many people in here know who their great-great-grandparents were? Great. Thank you, Ancestry.com. Let's go back a little further. 6 generations ago, how many people here know who at least some of their 6, this would be great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents? Good. Yeah, we have, you have all these, it's like a family tree going back. I know some of these people in the family tree, but I can't say I know all of them. How about 60 generations ago? That would take us back to the 1st century. Anybody know anybody? Well, I have this great fantasy because there was in ancient Rome a family called Fabius. And I have no proof. And they were pretty illustrious. You know, one bishop of Rome, 4 saints, Christian saints, a famous general, and an orator. So I like to think, I cling to the idea that I was descended from them. But I don't know. I have no proof. And so it's very hard. Yeah, Raymond. I'm sorry? I'm going to let you, since we're recording this.
I said, no one can prove they're not your ancestors.
Yeah, exactly. It's very hard to prove a negative, you know. So let's try to look at it, because people who say, oh, well, we don't have any proof that Jesus existed, you're talking 60 generations ago. It's very difficult to prove that anybody existed 60 generations ago. There we go. Wait, hold on.
We have mounting genetic evidence that a population of your ancestors were there when we find their remains in Pompeii or someplace like that. Exactly. And lo and behold, you both have some of the same basic DNA.
Yes, yeah, so there's hope. And that's actually a good, thanks for asking that, because we are finding more and more, there's more and more archaeological evidence that things existed that we didn't know about, which is kind of where we're going. Let's give a shot to prove that somebody existed 60 generations ago. Christianity makes the claim that Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. We're going to examine that. We're going to ask ourselves and each other what proof is there, and why I'm even bringing this up. Last spring, we did about 4 or 5 weeks on the Nicene Creed. For those of you who were there, thank you. And as we were doing that, a lot of times peripheral questions would kind of come up. A lot of people assumed that at the Council of Nicaea, one side was saying that Jesus was God, and the other side was saying that he wasn't. That was not true. At the Council of Nicaea, both sides, although they disagreed about things, there was no disagreement about Jesus, A, having existed, and B, being God. So let's just kind of jump into it. How do we know Jesus? Well, obviously from the Gospels, but is the Bible and are the Gospels accurate? Already, you know, we've just gotten started, and already we're in the weeds here, because how do we know the Bible's accurate? What do we mean by accurate? Certainly, there are differences in the Gospels, differences in the birth narratives, differences in Jesus' ministry. Matthew says that Jesus gave a sermon on a mountaintop. Luke says that the same sermon was given, but on a plain, not a, plane. And some people have solved that by saying, well, he gave that sermon a lot. Most preachers, have a stump speech, and it's quite possible that the Sermon on the Mount was also the Sermon on the Plain. Until the 1600s, nobody really questioned the historicity of the Gospels or the existence of Jesus. Well, to be fair, until the 1600s, nobody questioned the existence of Troy, and nobody questioned the existence of King Arthur. But then what happened in the 1600s is you get science beginning to develop. And once science begins to develop, people want to know more. They want to know why, and they want to know if stuff really happened. And so really by, I would say, the 1800s, Most people did not believe that Troy existed, that it was a fictional account. Same thing with King Arthur. We could probably throw in Noah's Ark. Well, nowadays, mostly because of archaeological evidence, we now know that Troy, in fact, did exist. You can visit the ruins of Troy. Some scholars, not all, believe that there's compelling evidence that King Arthur existed. He's not the knight in shining armor that we had kind of assumed from the accounts in the 1300s, but we think he existed. And so we're moving more and more toward finding evidence of Jesus's ministry and finding evidence of him existing. People wanted proof all of a sudden. We can question some parts of Scripture, and a lot of it with Scripture, it comes down to how close to the events was it all written down. I don't want to be biased, but the New Testament accounts tend to were all written down much closer to the events than most of the Old Testament accounts. Some of those existed in oral tradition for hundreds of years before anybody wrote it down. That's not to say that it didn't happen, but it's just to say that it is a little harder to prove that Moses parted the Red Sea, or to prove that. I think most people accept the idea now that David was the king in Israel, but it's a little harder to prove. The New Testament was all written down within 70 to 80 years of the events it describes. So, when you think about it, the 1960s were a long time ago. They were 60 years ago, but many of us have pretty vivid memories of things that happened. The assassination of President Kennedy, the landing on the moon. How many people remember that? Yeah, and if you you weren't there, obviously, but you could write down your experience of that. And the closer you were to it, I was in high school on my way home from a date, and the car broke down, so I did not see it that night. But many of you probably did. Many of you were probably glued to the TV, and you could write that down. You could write down your account of that. So when we're talking about the New Testament, we're talking mostly about things that were written down by people who had memories of it, people who were witnesses to it, or people who were disciples of witnesses to it. So your children probably do not remember the moon landing, but you can tell them that you saw it, and you can tell them, about it. Some accounts of those events were written down as close as 15 to 30 years from the events, which is very credible. When you have something that's written down that close, think about 30 years ago, 1995. You could probably write down your memories from 1995. If you had a big vacation that year, if you went to Italy, you could. The OJ, we all remember OJ's Bronco ride. Yeah, I was teaching at the time, and my students had a really weird and diverse response to that, to that whole thing. Literary evidence of Jesus's existence. we're talking mostly here about literary proof because we don't have a lot of archaeological proof. Again, this is a very complex issue. What kind of archaeological evidence could we have of Jesus? He didn't, although his name was carved on many buildings, it wasn't carved until much later because it was illegal to be a Christian. So they weren't exactly, buildings, carving statues of Jesus and putting them in the town square until the 300s. They would have if they could have, but they couldn't. Did Jesus produce any writings? None that we know of. There's a temptation to say no, but I don't know. As Wayne pointed out, the excavations in Pompeii are revealing more and more every day. And I kind of have this idea that Pompeii was destroyed in 79. I started to say 1979. So if a Christian group was in Pompeii, if Jesus had written something down, if that got taken to Pompeii, it could still exist. Or we could find an early copy of one of the Gospels in Pompeii. That's completely conceivable. The earliest complete Gospels we have right now would be something that was written down around 400. That doesn't mean that the earliest Gospel wasn't written till 400. It just means that the earliest copy that we have wasn't written until 400. Are there contemporary writings from secondary sources about Jesus? Yes, that's what the Gospels and the letters are. They are contemporary writings. They happened pretty close to the time, so they have some pretty good credibility. Is this literature biased? Dawkins, who is a kind of an atheistic activist and loves to publish books and articles about how Jesus didn't exist, says that you can't go by the Gospels and the letters of Paul because they were biased. Well, everything was biased in those days. They didn't have Time magazine. They weren't attempting to be objective. Everybody who wrote something, even like the historians, like Josephus and Tacitus, had an agenda. They were proving that Rome was a great and wondrous place. And so Josephus never really kind of covered any of Rome's big defeats, but he pointed out a lot of Rome's victories. References to people, places, and events that are verifiable. Yes, there are in the Gospels and in the letters, there are numerous references to people and places. Herod, Pilate, Passover, a lot of things that we find in the Gospels are things that would have probably not been there had it been all made up. Any questions, any thoughts at this point? Good question. Why are we so obsessed with finding proof about all this stuff? What did you say about science?
Well, as science for how, as faith for why.
Yeah, okay. why don't we just ask science for how and ask faith for why? Very good statement. I mean, the problem is that science came out of faith. Science in the 1600s, you've got these people like Galileo, and we focus on how they were persecuted by the church, but really that whole idea came out of the church.
I think part of it is wanting to get past the whisper down the line issue. As kids, we played whisper down the line. You start with a saying at the beginning of the line, and you always are amazed at how convoluted it becomes at the end of the line. I think part of it is not necessarily needing to prove that Jesus existed, but wanting to find out, what was said at the beginning of the line as opposed to what has come to us at the end of the line.
Yeah, we used to call it telephone. But yeah, exactly. I mean, we do have this kind of compelling need to know if everything happened or how it happened, and did George Washington really cut down that tree? The answer is no. Things about Abraham Lincoln, things about medieval popes. We love to, watch TV shows that reveal the truth about the Tudors. One of my daughters is like a Tudor expert. She has read every book on the Tudor dynasty and on Anne Boleyn and all that stuff. Yeah.
The point, I just wanted to make a point. Look at all the stuff that's out on the internet. Look at all the stuff that's out on the internet. It's really hard to separate sometimes what's fact and what's rumor and what's misinformation. And I think a lot of what's driving this line of inquiry into Jesus is trying to separate out truth from rumor and misinformation.
Yes, exactly. If you go on the internet and type in, "Did Jesus exist?" you will get hundreds of responses. Some of them are from atheists, some of them are from Christians, some of them are from Jewish people. There's kind of a major industry of trying to prove that Jesus either didn't exist or did exist and wasn't the Messiah. And so you guys are getting ahead of me amazingly, so thank you for that, because you're kind of carrying, this leads us to the quest for the historical Jesus. There is an official scientific quest for the historical Jesus. We could do 1 or 2 Sundays on that alone. It started in 1906 with the publishing of The Quest for the Historical Jesus, a book by Albert Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer did a lot of agonizing search and finally concluded that there is a Jesus of history, the Jesus who walked around in Galilee. There is a Christ of faith, the Christ we believe in through our theology. He concluded that we cannot prove the Jesus of history. We can only choose to cling to the idea of the Christ of faith. For his trouble, he was sent to Africa as a missionary. That's how quickly the theological community chose not to embrace his ideas. So then there was a second, then there was a whole period that lasted almost 45 years, from 1906 to the early 50s, 1950s, which was called the No Quest. Everybody just said, we got to get away from this topic because it's not going to take us anywhere. And then in the 1950s, another possibility for looking into the life of Jesus. I don't want to get too convoluted here. It was they called it form criticism. It was looking at the Bible and trying to decide by the way it was written. Like you could pretty much look at texts like the Gospels and like the letters of Paul, and you can kind of say, well, this Pauline letter really could not have been written by Paul because the person who wrote it used different ways of explaining things. And so they assumed those were written, like the book of Hebrews, the letters Titus, and those, they came to the conclusion that those were written by a disciple of Paul. And then we're going to get there, okay? The quest was an attempt to reconstruct the earthly life of Jesus, who he was, what he did, what he said, using all the evidence at our disposal, and realizing that you're trying to put something back together from 2,000 years ago. Now, it's not hard to talk about an emperor of Rome that lived 2,000 years ago, because there were things carved on walls about him. There were statues. There were histories. But to talk about a preacher in Jerusalem who lived 2,000 years ago and only taught for 3 years and was executed is a little more difficult. Are the Gospels historically accurate? We keep coming back to that. Very few documents from that time made any effort at historical accuracy. It just wasn't a thing. Everybody who wrote anything down had an agenda. And it's kind of more unusual that we attempt to be objective. The Gospels were arguments, not histories, that Jesus was the Messiah. And they were written when some of the witnesses were still alive. If you think about the Holocaust, for years nobody wrote a lot about the Holocaust. And then in the 80s, they began to notice all the people who were survivors of the Holocaust are beginning to die off. And we need to get that stuff recorded. So you can go to Washington, D.C., and there's the Shoah Project. You can go into the museums and you can listen into the Holocaust Museum, and you can actually listen to the first-person accounts of people who survived the camps. I think the same thing happened here. Because you might want to ask, well, why did they wait so long to write it down? Because I think they were fine with it until they noticed all the people who knew Jesus, all the people who heard him, all the people who saw his ministry, his healings. Those people are all dying out. We need to write it down. And I think that's why we got the Gospels when we did. In the Gospels, there is no attempt to prove that Jesus existed, which I think suggests that he did. If there was a question, if people were saying he didn't exist, you would see in the Gospels some attempt to prove his existence, some attempt to make the point that he did live. And they don't. They just assume, we're going to tell you about Jesus. Some of them start with the birth, and some of the gospel writers are just like, nah, that part's not important. Let's just start with his public ministry. So that, again, is another argument for his existence. Let's talk about the temple, because the temple figures in here very importantly. The temple was the center of Judaism in a way that Christianity has no parallel. You might think, oh, we have the Vatican. The Vatican is the center of our faith. Kinda, sorta, if you're Catholic. But the temple was a whole 10 steps higher than that. The temple was the only place in the world where sacrifices could be made. The only place. It's like if St. Peter's in Rome was the only place that liturgy could be celebrated. Animals could not be sacrificed anywhere outside of the temple. And so this is why everybody went to Jerusalem for the Passover. People made pilgrimages to Jerusalem for the Passover because it was the only place that all of that could happen. It was, I guess there could be a parallel with the Muslims have Mecca. Yes, I didn't have quite enough coffee. Yeah, so there, all Muslims are expected to go to Mecca at least once. But the temple, if you were a good Jew, you were expected to go more than once, as much as possible. And the temple is where Judaism stored all of their proofs and kept everything. So the big news is the temple was destroyed around 70 AD, just as the Christian community was beginning to build. Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jewish leadership was exiled and scattered around 135 AD. They burned, in 70, they destroyed the temple. In 135, they burned Jerusalem to the ground completely. And this is when the Jews were scattered into the diaspora, where they stayed until 1948. The Gospels were written between 70 and 100 AD. So you can imagine that this was a very, very, very chaotic time for Jews and Christians. The Romans were coming in and destroying everything. This is not a good time to be keeping all your records, right? Another key moment in this proof of Jesus' existence, I think, is Nero's persecution. Nero, of course, was the emperor of Rome. He was a little unhinged. He loved to play his harp. He did a lot of not such good stuff. A fire destroyed 30% of Rome around 50 AD. Huge fire. Imagine a fire destroying 30% of New York City. Big, big. Rumors started that the Emperor Nero had started the fire because it was kind of the slums of Rome that burned. And the story was that Nero wanted to rebuild Rome and kind of, get rid of all the slums. The people got really upset, and there was a large Christian community in Rome at this time. How do we know that? This we can prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Nero blamed the fire on the Christians because he was afraid that the people were going to storm the palace and kill him. And so there was this group, and he blamed the fire on the group and began to round people up and persecute them. Thousands were killed, not only in Rome, but throughout. There were kind of like copycat persecutions throughout the empire. So we know this. This was recorded by Roman historians, and we know exactly when it happened. In this persecution, we don't have proof that Peter and Paul were killed in the persecution, but it's a strong tradition. In fact, St. Peter's in Rome was built on the site that they think Peter was crucified. He was crucified upside down, again, according to tradition. So I think this is really compelling evidence. By 50 AD, you've got a large community of Christians in Rome. This was only 30 years after the crucifixion. So let's review. This guy is arrested and crucified in Jerusalem. Rome was about 5,000 miles away if you walked, which is the way most people traveled, because you had to go up through Croatia, what's now Croatia. It is around 1,500 miles as the crow flies, but think about how slow things happened in those days. They didn't have like TV and social media and stuff, so it would have taken probably a couple of years for the news that this guy got crucified in Jerusalem to even reach Rome. It would have taken a long time for a community to build up there. How could this happen in 30 years if somebody just made it up? By the way, there are some of the people on the web claim that Constantine made the whole story up. Ever since the Da Vinci Code, there's been kind of a lot of interest in this. And Constantine now gets credit for everything, for writing the Bible, for deciding what books were in the Bible, for pulling books out of the Bible. None of that is true. And we can pretty much prove it all. I mean, if Constantine made it all up in 325, how could there have been a persecution in 65 AD? Could this all have happened if Jesus was fictitious, if he had not lived, if he had not died? Something really compelling is going on here. A preacher is executed, which was no big deal. The Romans, crucified people pretty regularly. We all know the story of Spartacus. After Spartacus and his army, now Spartacus, you say, well, why was Spartacus recorded? Why were there records of Spartacus and not Jesus? Because Spartacus raised an army, and Rome was all about war. So they record, especially if Rome won, they recorded the whole story of this slave who raised an army and marched against Rome. 2,000 of his followers were crucified. We all know the I am Spartacus, story. So it's, again, for me, I think it's just a very compelling part of the story. Probably the most compelling evidence that Jesus existed and that people began to follow him very early. Evidence from non-Christian sources. Tacitus was actually a Roman historian, and Josephus, who was a Jew who had kind of gone over to the Roman side, both made reference to Jesus in their writings, which were in the mid-2nd century, although some historians question it, other people accept it as true. Again, trying to prove anything this long ago, like you can't say everybody accepts this. Every bit of this story, some people accept it, some people don't. Some people think Jesus did this, some people think he didn't. Some people think Tacitus and Josephus actually mentioned him. Others think, oh, no, that was all redacted later by Christians, by monks in monasteries who were recopying all this stuff, and they were kind of juicing up the part about Jesus. I don't know. Personally, I think they probably mentioned Jesus, but the monks who later, copied all this stuff might have made it a little better, a little more compelling story. Yeah, Dick.
Josephus's writings may have been that late, 2nd century, but he was a participant in the Jewish War, so he was on the scene in the 60s. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Very important, the discovery of Qumran and the Nag Hammadi texts in the 1940s. This was the latest of the quests for the historical Jesus. When these were found, it opened up a whole new level of information that affected the belief in proving Jesus' existence. I'm going to kind of go through these quickly. They provided new insight. The idea behind this, because Jesus is not mentioned in any of these texts, but his context was how he lived, what was going on, what was happening at the time. And the idea behind this was if we can understand his context, we can understand him better. They consist of a large number of Jewish and Christian works written from 250 BC to 300 AD. The Dead Sea Scrolls were Jewish. The Nag Hammadi texts had some Jewish writings, but were mostly Christian. They provided many parallels to Jesus' community and teaching. They contained additional gospels. Now you've all heard like, oh, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of James, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. We knew these existed, but we had no idea what they said because they had been lost. We only knew they existed by references in some other works that did last. They provide insight into baptism, ritual meals, messianic hopes that are similar to Jesus' teachings. Again, this is another whole thing we could spend a whole Sunday on, is talking about the Essenes at Qumran who left us the Nag Hammadi texts. They were kind of a messianic group, and we know they had ritual baptism, not Jesus' baptism, not a once-in-your-life baptism, but the baptism of John was very, very similar to what was practiced by the Essenes. And it was more like confession. Like if you felt like you needed to be cleansed, you got baptized, and then you were good till the next time you felt like you needed to be cleansed. So, in conclusion, Paul testified to Jesus' existence in 45 to 64 AD. His first letter was only 15 years after Jesus' crucifixion. The Gospels were written later and made references to places and events that we know actually happened. Nero's persecution proves that large Christian communities existed within a few decades. The Nag Hammadi and Dead Sea Scrolls offer compelling arguments for his life and ministry. And I think when we put this all together, it provides very strong evidence that Jesus existed and that he influenced the world profoundly. Any questions? Thoughts? Yes, we have very solid proof for Jesus' influence on the world. And that's really the biggest argument for me, is that this preacher in Galilee was executed as a criminal, and within a few decades, people all over the Mediterranean had their lives changed because they accepted him as the Messiah. So I just want to, in conclusion, kind of reassure you that when you hear people, and especially a lot of young people, throwing around the idea that Jesus never existed or Jesus was just taken all out of context, I think we have a very strong foundation of the fact that thousands and thousands of people's lives were changed within 10 or 20 or 30 years. You can't discount that. So I think it really kind of gives us a foundation for belief, if I can put it that way. Anybody else? Nope. Thank you for coming. Wayne.
Very quickly, the difference in comparison is something we now call data that you can observe, record, see, measure, and it has to be repeatable. And yet, on the other hand, what we're really talking about is relational experiences, people to people.
Yes, exactly. We live in a very data-rich culture. There's data all around us. There's the web. You can, if you suddenly go like, oh, who was the lead in Legally Blonde? Oh, none of us know, but we can pull out our phones and access it immediately. When I was young, we had to just live in ignorance for the rest of our lives, and it would just let it destroy us. I know it's late, so if you have to go, please. Wait, Connie?
I think the interesting part is the leap from him being a person to all of a sudden he's God.
Yeah, and we're this is a 4-week process, so you're probably sitting there thinking like, well, what about the part Jesus being God? You didn't even talk about that. We're going to get there, I promise. Oh yeah, one more. Oops. Let me try this. I had another slide for you that said that. Next week, divinity. We're going to talk about this God stuff. What did the Romans think about God and divinity? What did the Jews think in the first century? And what do we think? And I'll give you a little spoiler. It's very, very different.